"No one will ever believe you," my husband said to me, with the calm, easy certainty of a man who had spent years quietly making sure of it. He said it the night I finally told him I knew everything about the affair, about the money, about the second life he'd been so sure he'd hidden, about all of it. He didn't deny a single word. He just smiled, the slow, easy, almost pitying way you smile at someone you've already beaten, and he said it again, slower this time, spacing the words out so they would sink all the way in. "No one will ever believe you. It's your word against mine, and everyone knows whose word that's going to be." He even patted my shoulder when he said it, the way you'd reassure a child about something they couldn't possibly understand. And here is the thing he did not know. The one thing that turned that sentence from a threat into the single most satisfying mistake he ever made in his life? I didn't need anyone to believe me. Not one person. I wasn't relying on my word. I had spent the previous several months quietly, patiently assembling something far stronger and far colder than belief. I had the receipts. I had the documents. This is the story of the heist I ran on a man who was so sure no one would ever take my side that he never bothered to hide anything from the one person keeping receipts. I'm going to break it down for you the way it actually happened, step by step in 5 careful moves, and I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why "no one will ever believe you" is the sentence that should terrify the person who says it, and quietly empower the person who hears it. But before I begin, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Has anyone ever told you that no one would believe you used your own fear of not being believed to keep you silent? What was the situation? Be honest, because that single sentence is one of the most common tools of control there is, and naming it out loud takes away half its power. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And before I break it down, I want to say something directly to anyone who has had those exact words used on them. No one will ever believe you, because I know how heavy that sentence is, and I know what it does to a person. It is designed to make you feel completely alone, as if the truth itself is worthless unless someone powerful co-signs it. But I need you to hear the flip side of it. The side they never want you to see. A person only says no one will believe you when they know the thing you'd be telling is true. You don't threaten someone's credibility about a lie. You don't need to. The sentence is, in its own twisted way, a confession and admission that what you know is real and dangerous to them, and that their only defense is your silence. So when you hear it, don't hear a verdict. Hear a confession, and then, very calmly, start keeping the receipts. First, you have to understand why he was so confident, because his confidence is the whole reason this worked. My husband, Grant, was charming, genuinely, effortlessly charming, the kind of man everyone liked the moment they met him. He was the one who told the funny stories at parties, who remembered everyone's birthday, who picked up the check with a flourish, who had built over the years an airtight reputation as the warm and reasonable one in our marriage. And alongside that reputation, quietly, patiently, like a man laying a foundation he knew he'd build on someday, he had constructed another story, a story about me. That I was emotional, that I was a little unstable, that I exaggerated. He'd planted it gently, patiently, over years, in 1,000 small offhand comments to our friends, our families, anyone who'd listen. She gets these ideas. You know how she can be. So that by the time it actually mattered, the groundwork was already long laid. I was the unreliable one, and he was the steady, trustworthy one. And anything I ever said about him would land in a world that had already been prepared to doubt me. I want to name what this actually is, because for years I didn't have a word for it, and not having a word for it kept me trapped. What Grant was doing has a name. It's sometimes called preemptive discrediting, and it is one of the oldest and most effective forms of control there is. It works like this. The controlling person doesn't wait for you to accuse them of something and then defend themselves. They get ahead of it. They quietly establish, long before there's anything to accuse, that you are the unreliable narrator of your own life, too emotional, too dramatic, too prone to ideas, so that on the day you finally do speak a true thing about them, the ground beneath your words has already been salted. People nod sympathetically at him and exchange a glance, because they've been prepared for months to hear your truth as just another one of her episodes. It is a brilliant, cruel strategy, and the most insidious part is that it often makes the victim start to doubt herself too, because if everyone treats you as unreliable, you begin to wonder if you are. I spent years wondering. The day I stopped wondering and started documenting was the day I began to win. So when he told me no one would ever believe me, he wasn't bluffing. In a sense, he was completely right. If it had truly come down to my word against his, I would have lost, and lost badly. He had spent years making sure of it. But here is what years of being quietly undermined had taught me, the lesson that became the foundation of everything. If no one will believe your word, then stop relying on your word. Build something that doesn't require anyone to believe you. Build a record. This reframe saved my life, and I want to slow down on it because it is the single most useful thing in this entire story. When you are caught in a war of credibility against someone more charming, more established, more practiced than you will lose every time, as long as the contest is who do people believe. That is a game rigged against you, and no amount of sincerity or volume or tears will unrig it. So the move is not to play that game harder. The move is to refuse to play it at all, to change the contest from belief to evidence. Belief is subjective. It bends toward charm, toward reputation, toward whoever tells the better story. Evidence is objective. It sits there on the page, indifferent to charisma, and it says the same thing no matter who's reading it. The instant I stopped trying to be believed and started building a record that needed no belief, the entire balance of power shifted, even though nothing in my outward life had changed yet. I had stopped fighting on his terms. And the person who chooses the terms of the fight usually wins it. Move 1, I stopped arguing, and I started documenting. This was the shift that changed everything, and it happened quietly, inside my own head, long before I did anything visible. For years, I had been fighting Grant the way you fight someone you love, with words, with feelings, with the desperate hope that if I just explained clearly enough, he'd see it, he'd admit it, he'd stop. And it never worked. Because you cannot win an argument with someone whose goal is not truth, but control. So I stopped. I stopped trying to make him admit things. I stopped trying to be believed in the moment. And instead, every time something happened, every lie I caught, every inconsistency, every cold cruelty, I simply, quietly, wrote it down, saved it, filed it away. I stopped performing the truth and started preserving it. There is a quiet kind of relief in that shift that I did not expect, and I want to offer it to anyone watching who is exhausted from years of trying to make someone admit what they've done. When you stop needing the other person to acknowledge the truth, you get a piece of yourself back. For years, so much of my energy had gone into the futile project of getting Grant to confess, to see me, to validate my reality, and every failed attempt left me more drained and more doubtful. The day I let that go, the day I decided that his acknowledgement was no longer the goal, and that a quiet record was, I stopped handing him my peace. I no longer needed him to agree that something had happened, because I had it written down. The truth no longer depended on his cooperation, which meant it was finally fully mine. Documentation isn't just a legal strategy. It's a way of taking your reality out of the hands of someone who keeps trying to rewrite it and putting it somewhere they can't reach. Move 2. I gathered the financial record because money does not lie and money does not care who's charming. This was the move that turned a personal heartbreak into an actual case, and it's the one I'd tell anyone in my position to focus on first, because it's the most objective evidence there is. Here's the beautiful thing about documents. Especially financial ones, they are completely immune to charm. A bank statement does not care that Grant tells a good story at parties. A transaction record does not find him reasonable and likable. Numbers simply are what they are. So while Grant was busy out in the world maintaining his reputation as the trustworthy one, the reasonable one, the likable one, I was quietly, methodically assembling the financial truth of our marriage, the records of the money he'd moved, the spending I wasn't supposed to see, the trail that led, dollar by documented dollar, to the second life he was so sure I couldn't prove. He'd built his whole defense, his entire towering confidence, on the single fragile idea that it would all come down to my word against his, and his would win. He never considered that I might bring something to the fight that had no word at all, only evidence. And I want to say something here for anyone worried that gathering financial records sounds complicated or sneaky, because it is neither. I am not talking about hacking or breaking into anything or doing a single thing I wasn't entitled to do. I'm talking about the ordinary records of a shared marital life, statements, accounts, documents that I had every right to see as a spouse, that simply passed through our household, and that I, for once, actually paid attention to instead of letting Grant handle. That's the quiet truth at the center of so many of these stories. The evidence was never hidden in some vault. It was sitting in plain sight, in the mail, in the accounts, in the shared records of a life two people built together. The only reason it stayed invisible for so long was that I had been trained, gently, over years, to not look to leave the money to him, to assume I wouldn't understand it, to stay in my designated lane as the emotional one. The day I started looking was the day the vault turned out to have been open the entire time. If you've ever been in a situation where you knew the truth but felt powerless to prove it, where someone's reputation seemed bulletproof against your reality, do me one quick favor before I tell you the next move. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, strategic revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage, and your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, being told that no one will ever believe her. And believe me, the moment those documents hit the table is the part you came for. Move 3. I kept the receipts on the story itself, the lies, dated and preserved. This was the move Grant never saw coming, because it turned his own favorite weapon directly against him. His whole strategy was to make my words untrustworthy. So my whole counter-strategy became, build a case made of as few of my words as possible. For years he'd been telling people I was unreliable, that I exaggerated, that I made things up. So I made very sure that the things I documented were the kind that could not be waved away as exaggeration. Not my feelings about what he'd said, the actual things, in his own words, where he'd put them in writing, the messages, the records, the places where his own communications contradicted the stories he told everyone else. Because the most powerful way to defeat she exaggerates is to have so little of your own interpretation in the file that there's nothing left to call an exaggeration, just his words, his transactions, his own documented choices, speaking for themselves. I learned in those months the difference between evidence and venting, and it is a distinction that changed how I thought about everything. Venting is when you tell the story of how someone wronged you, full of your pain and your interpretation and your conclusions. It feels good. and it matters, and there's a place for it with a friend, with a therapist, in your journal. But venting is exactly what a charming liar wants you to do publicly, because your pain and your interpretation are precisely the things he's already primed everyone to discount. Evidence is the opposite. Evidence has no emotion in it. It doesn't say he was cruel to me. It shows a transaction, a message, a contradiction, and lets the person looking draw the cruel conclusion themselves. I trained myself, in everything I preserved, to strip out my feelings and keep only the facts, because I understood that my feelings, however valid, were the weakest part of my case, and the facts were the strongest. Save your feelings for the people who love you. Save the facts for the file. Move 4. I went to a lawyer, and I brought the file, not the feelings. And I want to tell you what happened in that office, because it was the moment I knew I'd already won. I sat down across from my lawyer, and I did not cry, and I did not tell her my husband was a bad man. I simply opened the file and laid it out, the financial record, the documented communications, the dated timeline of a double life. She went through it, page by page, quietly, in no hurry, occasionally making a small note. I sat there in silence, watching a professional examine the evidence of my own life, and I noticed my hands had stopped shaking for the first time in months. When she finished, she set the file down, and she looked up at me, and she said 3 things I will never forget. The first thing, and she said it looking right at me, I want you to understand something. Most people come to me with a story and hope I can find the proof. You've come to me with the proof, and you don't even need the story. This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've seen. The second, she explained that everything Grant had built his confidence on his charm, his reputation. The years of painting me as unreliable was completely irrelevant in the face of documentation. Charm doesn't survive a paper trail, she said. A judge has seen 1,000 charming men. What a judge responds to is evidence, and you have it. His likability isn't admissible. These records are. And the third thing she said, quietly, was the one that I carried with me into every hard moment after. She said, "He told you no one would believe you. He was counting on a fight about credibility. We're not going to have that fight. We're going to have a fight about facts. And the facts are all on your side." Walking out of that office, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, solid. For so long, Grant's confidence had made me feel like I was standing on sand, like maybe he was right. Maybe no one would believe me. Maybe I really was the unreliable one. His certainty was contagious, and I'd caught it, and it had been quietly eroding my sense of my own reality for years. But sitting across from a professional who dealt in facts for a living, watching her nod at my documentation, hearing her say the facts were on my side, it was like stepping off the sand and onto stone. The ground stopped shifting. And I realized that his entire power over me had been built on keeping me unsure, keeping me off balance, keeping me wondering whether I was the problem. The documents didn't just win my case. They ended the wondering. They gave me back the solid ground he'd spent years pulling out from under me, and once I was standing on it, I was never going to step off again. Move 5. I let him keep believing he'd already won until the documents were on the table. This was the final and most important move, and it required the most discipline. Because Grant, right up until the end, was utterly confident. He walked into the divorce the way he walked into every room, sure of himself, sure of his charm, sure that it would come down to his word against his unstable wife's, a contest he'd spent years rigging. And I let him believe it, every single day, right to the end. I did not warn him. I did not tip my hand. I did not give him so much as a flicker of doubt to work with. I let him build his entire strategy on the assumption that I had nothing but my unreliable word. Because the moment he understood I had documentation, he'd have started managing it, hiding things, getting careful. So I let him stay confident and careless, right up until the day his confidence walked into a room and met a folder. And confidence, I have learned, is the easiest thing in the world to use against someone. Because a confident person stops checking. They stop hiding. They stop being careful, precisely because they're so sure they've already won. Grant's certainty that I had nothing was the very thing that let me gather everything. And when that day came, I did not raise my voice. I simply let the documents speak. The financial trail traced and dated. The cold record. His own words, in his own writing, contradicting his own carefully told stories. Everything he'd been so sure I could never prove, laid out, organized, dated, undeniable. I watched that famous, effortless charm falter for the very first time in our entire 14-year marriage. Because charm has no answer to a bank statement, and never has. There is no winning smile in the world that makes a documented transaction disappear. I had spent 14 years watching that smile work on everyone, waiters, friends, my own family, me. It was the most reliable thing about him. And to watch it finally fail, to watch it come up against something it had no power over, was like watching a key that had opened every door in his life arrive at the one lock it didn't fit. He kept reaching for it instinctively, the charm, the warmth, the reasonable tone. And it just slid off the documents, every time. The story he'd spent years building, the unreliable wife, the trustworthy husband, simply dissolved. Because stories dissolve in the presence of records. Every single time. I said the only sentence I had prepared. I said, "Grant, you told me no one would ever believe me." You were right. So I made sure I'd never need them to. I didn't bring my word. I brought the documents. The silence after I said that is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. For our entire marriage, Grant had never once been without a response. He always had the charming deflection, the reasonable reframe, the gentle suggestion that I was overreacting. Words were his weapon, and he was a master of them. But there is no charming deflection for a folder. There is no reasonable reframe of a bank statement. For the first time in all the years I'd known him, I watched Grant open his mouth and have nothing come out. Because the one tool he'd always relied on, his ability to talk his way out of anything, simply doesn't work against paper. You can out-talk a person. You cannot out-talk a document. And in that silence, I understood that I had finally found the one room where his charm didn't reach. And I had built it myself, page by page, out of the very evidence he'd been so sure I could never assemble. The divorce was not the divorce Grant had been so sure of. It couldn't be, because the entire foundation of his confidence that it would come down to credibility, his against mine, never materialized. The documents made credibility irrelevant. The financial truth came out and was counted. The story he'd told for years collapsed under the weight of his own preserved choices. Everything he'd built to protect himself, the reputation, the charm, the carefully seated doubts about me, turned out to be made of air the moment it met something solid. And the thing about air is that it offers no resistance at all. His whole defense didn't so much break as simply vanish, because there had never been anything underneath it but other people's belief, and belief evaporates the instant the facts walk in. He walked away with far less than he had ever assumed his charm would protect, and I walked away with a fair settlement, my reputation quietly restored by the simple fact of being proven right, and the deep, steadying satisfaction of a woman who'd been told she was unbelievable and had answered not with louder words, but with quieter proof. But the part I treasure most isn't the settlement, and it isn't even the look on his face. It's what happened slowly, in the months afterward, among the people he'd spent years preparing to doubt me. Because here's what a documented truth does that a shouted truth never can. It travels quietly, and it corrects the record without my ever having to launch a campaign. I didn't have to go around telling people Grant had lied. I didn't have to defend myself or relitigate the years he'd spent painting me as unstable. The facts did that work, calmly, on their own. The friends who'd been gently warned about my ideas slowly came to understand which of us had actually been telling the truth all along, not because I argued it, but because reality has a way of asserting itself once the documentation is out. The reputation he'd so carefully built for me dissolved, and the one he'd built for himself went with it. I didn't have to destroy his story. I just had to prove mine, and let the contrast do the rest. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not just as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who was told for years that no one would ever believe her, it's this. When someone tells you that no one will believe you, listen very carefully. Because they have just told you something important. They have told you that they're afraid of the truth, and that their entire defense rests on your silence. So don't give them your silence. But also, and this is the part that matters most, don't just give them louder words, either. Because they've already prepared the world to doubt your words. Give them a record. Document calmly. Preserve the truth instead of just shouting it. Belief is fragile and can be poisoned by a charming liar. Evidence cannot. The people who truly love you will never need to convince the world in advance that you're unreliable. The ones who do are telling you exactly what they're planning, and the quietest, most powerful thing you can do is start, today, keeping the receipts. And I want to add one more thing, gently, for anyone watching who recognizes this pattern in their own life: the charming partner, the quiet undermining, the creeping sense that you've become the unreliable one in your own story. Please hear this clearly. The fact that you've started to doubt yourself is not evidence that you're unreliable. It's evidence that someone has been working very hard to make you feel that way. That self-doubt was installed, it isn't native to you. And the antidote is not to argue with them about it, which only feeds the dynamic, but to quietly start trusting the part of you that notices things, the part that saw the inconsistency, felt the cold, knew something was wrong even when you were told you were imagining it. Start writing down what that part of you notices. Not for a fight, just for yourself, at first. Because the simple act of keeping a record is a way of telling yourself, I believe me. And once you believe you, it stops mattering quite so much whether anyone else does, and strangely, that's usually right around when they start. There's one more thing, though. After the divorce, as I was organizing the last of those documents to close everything out, I found something in the financial trail that I had missed the first time, a series of payments that revealed Grant's "no one will ever believe you" wasn't just about our marriage. It pointed to something he'd done long before he ever met me, to someone else, the same way. What I uncovered about who he really was, and what I did once I understood the pattern, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.